Why did the Soviet 45mm 45er gun keep fighting until the end of World War II? It's World War II. The battlefields are alive with the roar of tanks, the scream of shells, and the haze of smoke and fire. In the middle of this chaos stands a small but fierce Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun, nicknamed the 45er by the soldiers who relied on it. This scrappy little cannon was like a loyal dog, ready to take on any enemy, no matter the odds. But here's the kicker. By the middle of the war, German tanks had grown so tough that the 45er could barely dent their armor. So why did the Soviets keep making these guns all the way until 1944? Why not switch to something bigger and badder? Buckle up, because we're about to dive into the gripping, twist-filled story of a weapon that defied the odds and stayed in the fight until the very end. This whole journey started with a question from one of our viewers in the comments. If the 45er couldn't take out German tanks anymore, why wasn't it retired? Someone corrected them, pointing out that not only did the Soviets keep these guns in service, but they also kept producing them until late 1944, even after introducing an upgraded version in 1942. The viewer was stumped. Why keep making a gun that couldn't do its job? That question is like a key to a hidden vault, unlocking a tale of wartime grit, tough choices, and a little cannon that became a legend. In this deep dive, we'll uncover the origins of the 45er, explore why it was so vital to the Soviet Red Army, and reveal how it managed to stay relevant until the final days of the war. I'll throw in my own thoughts, some economic insights, and a bit of historical analysis to give you the full picture. So, grab a coffee, and let's get started. A Soviet icon with German roots. Let's rewind to the 1930s, a time when the world was still catching its breath from the Great Depression and gearing up for the storm of World War II. The Soviet Union was hard at work building up its military, and the Red Army needed a reliable anti-tank gun. Here's where things get wild. The 45er, which we think of as a purely Soviet creation, actually has German DNA. Back in 1930, the Soviets struck a deal with Germany to buy a 37mm anti-tank gun designed by the German company Rheinmetall. This wasn't just a random purchase. It was part of a bigger collaboration between the two nations before things went south. Soviet engineers, working in a secretive design bureau, known as a Sharashka, at Factory Number 8, took that 37mm gun and beefed it up to 45mm, creating the 45mm anti-tank gun model 1932. Why the bigger caliber? Because the Soviets wanted a gun that could not only punch through tank armor but also fire high-explosive shells to take out infantry and light fortifications. Smart move, right? Here's a juicy tidbit. Recent research shows that German engineers, hired by the Soviets, helped design the 45er. And get this, they pitched a 47mm version of the same gun to the Netherlands. So, the 45er was kind of an international project that ended up becoming a Soviet superstar. Who saw that coming? A star on the pre-war stage. When the 45mm gun hit the scene in 1932, it was a game changer. Back then, tanks had thin armor, usually 15 to 30mm, and the 45er could blast through it like a hot knife through butter at ranges up to 500 yards. Soviet manuals proudly called it the best gun in its class, and they weren't lying. Compared to German, French, or British anti-tank guns of the time, the 45er was either more powerful or easier to produce. But then, in late 1940, something shocking happened. The Soviets pulled the 45er from production. Why? Their intelligence reports warned that the Germans were developing new tanks with frontal armor 80mm thick or more. Against that kind of protection, the 45er would be about as useful as a BB gun. And the intel wasn't wrong. Germany was working on beasts like the Tiger and Panther, with armor that could shrug off most anti-tank rounds. Some of those German projects never made it to production, and others showed up later in the war, but the threat was real enough to make the Soviets rethink their arsenal. The ZIS-2, the gun that could have been. So, the 45er was out of date, and the Soviets needed a new weapon. Enter the 57mm ZIS-2 anti-tank gun, a beast that could punch through the armor of next-generation tanks. On paper, it was a dream weapon. Accurate, powerful, and ready to take on the future. But here's where things fell apart. Soviet factories couldn't handle it. Producing the ZIS-2 was a nightmare. Faulty barrels, defective shells, and sloppy assembly led to sky-high rejection rates. The gun was pulled from production before it could make a dent. There was another idea floating around, a 57mm gun based on the shell of a 76mm Czech mountain gun. It could have been a rival to the British 6-pounder, a highly effective anti-tank gun. But that project never got past the drawing board. So what did the Red Army have left? You guessed it, the trusty old 45er, which, as it turned out, struggled to penetrate even the 30mm armor of German PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks at long range. To understand why the Soviets couldn't just swap out the 45er, let's take a look at the economic realities of the time. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was racing to build a modern industrial base, but by 1941, many factories were still using outdated equipment, and skilled workers were in short supply. Making a complex gun like the ZIS-2 required precision machinery and expertise that the Soviets simply didn't have. Historical records show that in 1941, Soviet factories churned out about 18,000 45ers but only a few hundred ZIS-2s. Why? The 45er was simple, cheap, and already perfected in production. Even small factories with basic tools could pump them out. The ZIS-2, on the other hand, needed advanced equipment, which the Soviets only started getting through Lend-Lease aid in 1943. The war made things even tougher. In 1941 to 1942, the Soviets evacuated hundreds of factories to the Ural Mountains and Siberia to keep them out of German hands. This disrupted supply chains and slowed production. In that chaos, sticking with the reliable 45er was a no-brainer compared to gambling on a new, unproven design. Early battles, hope, and heartbreak. When World War II kicked off, the 45er was the Red Army's main anti-tank weapon. But by 1941, it was clear it was out of its league. German PZ-3 and PZ-4 tanks had 30 to 50 millimeters of armor, and the 45er could only penetrate it at close range if it got lucky. Soviet reports claimed it was effective against light tanks and could hit medium tanks in the side or rear, but that was more of a silver lining than a victory. The truth was the 45er was struggling. Still, it stayed in the fight. Why? Because the Red Army had no better options. The 76mm divisional guns, which became the backbone of Soviet anti-tank defenses, didn't arrive in large numbers until 1943. And the 85mm anti-aircraft guns, which could take on heavy tanks, were too bulky for mobile warfare. A new hope, the 1942 model. In 1942, the Soviets rolled out an upgraded version. The 45mm anti-tank gun model 1942, M42. With a longer barrel and better ammo, it could punch through up to 50mm of armor at 500 yards, enough to give medium tanks a headache, though it still couldn't touch the new German Panthers or Tigers with their 80 to 120mm armor. The M42 wasn't a silver bullet, but it was a lifeline for Soviet infantry. Its real strength was its mobility. Weighing just over 1,200 pounds, the M42 could be manhandled by a small crew or towed by a single horse. In urban combat, soldiers even hauled it up staircases to fire from upper floors. A sight that must have shocked German troops across the street. More than just tanks, the 45er's versatility. Here's where the 45er really shined. It wasn't just an anti-tank gun. Unlike the British 2-pounder, which only fired armor-piercing rounds, the 45er could lob high-explosive shells to take out infantry, machine gun nests, and light fortifications. This made it a jack-of-all-trades on the battlefield. The gun was a favorite among Soviet partisans, too. In forests and swamps, where tanks were rare, the 45er was perfect. It was light enough to be disassembled and carried across rivers or hidden in the woods. Partisan records show that nearly every major guerrilla unit had at least one of these guns, using them to ambush German convoys or hit outposts. Against older, captured German tanks, the 45er still packed a punch. So, Why keep making the 45er in 1943 and 1944 when bigger guns like the 76mm and 85mm were available? It comes down to economics and logistics. The 45er's production was a well-oiled machine. Factories knew how to build it, workers were trained, and materials were easy to come by. According to historian Mikhail Svyrin, the Soviets produced about 12,000 45ers in 1943 and another 7,000 in 1944. Compare that to the 57mm ZIS-2, which barely hit 1,000 units in 1943, even with Lend-Lease equipment. Cost was another factor. A 45er cost around 10,000 rubles in pre-war terms, while a ZIS-2 was nearly twice as expensive. In a war where every penny counted, the 45er was a budget-friendly choice. Logistics, the little gun that could keep up. Logistics sealed the deal. At just 1,200 pounds, the 45er was a featherweight compared to the 2,600-pound ZIS-2. It could be moved by 2 soldiers or a single horse, making it ideal for the muddy, snowy, or war-torn roads of the Eastern Front. In contrast, heavier guns needed trucks or tractors, which weren't always available. Imagine you're a Soviet infantry commander. The Germans are advancing, and you need to move fast to hold a river crossing. Do you pick the heavy 76mm gun that needs a vehicle to tow it, or the nimble 45er that your men can push by hand? The choice is obvious. The 45er wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience. In wartime films and books, it was the ever-present companion of the Red Army soldier. Think of those iconic newsreels showing crews rolling the gun through mud under enemy fire. Sure, some were staged, but they captured the spirit of the time. The 45er was there no matter what. Partisan memoirs, like Sidor Kovpaks From Putyvl to the Carpathians, tell stories of the 45er saving the day, like when it took out a German convoy in a daring ambush. These tales turned the gun into a legend. Why does the 45er still tug at our heartstrings? Because it was more than metal, it was part of the soldiers' lives. It was light, reliable, and always ready. Even when it couldn't pierce a tiger's armor, it kept firing, at infantry, at armored cars, at bunkers. It was the little gun that refused to give up, just like the men and women who fought with it. The 45er's story is about more than just a gun. It's about making tough calls in a crisis. Yes, it was outdated by 1943. Yes, it struggled against heavy tanks. But it was what the Red Army had, and it got the job done. This teaches us that sometimes a reliable, imperfect tool is better than waiting for a perfect one. War doesn't wait, and neither did the Soviets. They used what they had, and the 45er delivered. Economically, the 45er shows the power of sticking with what works. The Soviets could have poured resources into new guns, but that would have meant halting production at a time when every weapon counted. Instead, they kept the 45er rolling off assembly lines, ensuring their troops were never without support. We see this in modern business, too. Take Apple. They keep selling older iPhone models alongside new ones because they're reliable and profitable. It's the same logic that kept the 45er in production. The story of the 45mm gun is the story of a little cannon that became a giant. It wasn't perfect, but it was essential. It fought in fields, cities, and forests, in the hands of soldiers and partisans. It was part of the victory, even if it didn't grab the headlines. So why did the Soviets keep making the 45er until the end of the war? Because it was needed. It supported infantry, armed partisans, and held the line when nothing else could. It was simple, dependable, and versatile, a true unsung hero. Don't miss out. Subscribe to our channel for more epic stories like this. Drop a comment below. What do you think of the 45er? Did your family have any World War II stories tied to this gun? Share your thoughts, and let's keep the history alive together.